Session 7, word formation of Middle High German. First, some words on basic concepts. After we dealt with one sub-area of Middle High German morphology in the last session, namely the system of inflection morphology, word formation in Middle High German is on the agenda for today. I've already mentioned that from a formalistic point of view, word formation is part of morphology, but also has interfaces with lexis and syntax. This is not surprising, since word formation continually produces new lexical material using syntagmatic processes, and it competes with syntactic means of expression. But before we deal with the peculiarities of Middle High German word formation, let us first explain a few basic concepts of word formation in the contemporary language. In essence, there are two classification models for German word formation which differ in their approach rather than result, which is why both should be briefly discussed. Referring strictly to the signifier element, word formation processes can be classified according to whether there is 1. An expansion in the signifier, 2. A reduction, such as UFO or UFO instead of unknown flying object or unbekanntes Flugobjekt. It's the same pattern in German as well as in English. 3. A historical transparent reduction such as Flug from fliegen, an implicit derivation. Or 4. No modification of the signifier at all, as in the case of conversions like laufen. In signifier expansions, a distinction is made between compounds such as Kleinkind and explicit derivations such as kindlich. Their methodological consistency and their universal applicability permits us to divide expansions into these categories. The disadvantage lies in a lack of representativeness, as certain patterns of signifier expansion clearly dominate from the earliest point in the history of German. In order to take this fact into account, a mixed approach based on the distinction between the two most important basic types of word formation in German, composition and derivation, is often used to classify the patterns of German word formation. In compounding, a distinction is made between compounds of equal constituents, so-called copulative compounds such as schwarz-weiß, meaning black and white, or Hosenrock, a mixture of skirt and trousers, and compounds with dependencies between constituents, so-called determinative compounds, which can be further classified in terms of their semantics. Endocentric determinative compounds determine a subset of what is denoted by the base noun. Kleinkinder are still Kinder, while endocentric determinative compounds do not, for a variety of reasons. Wasserhahn, unlike an Auerhahn, is not animate. A special case in the field of composition are phrasal conversions, which means compounds that preserve traces of older syntactic structures, such as the genitive government of Middle High German vergessen in the New High German compound vergiss mein nicht. In the field of derivation, a distinction is made between explicit derivation using affixes and other cases. In explicit derivation, a base, usually a base morpheme, is transformed into a new word by adding a prefix, suffix or circumfix. The word class of the base can remain unchanged, as in the case of unschön, which arises from prefixing schön with un. In this case, one can speak of modification. If the word class of the base changes, as in the case of the suffixation of the adjective schön with heit, from which the noun Schönheit results, we speak of transposition as opposed to modification. The patterns of implicit derivation and conversion already mentioned must be distinguished from explicit derivation. Finally, synthetic compounds, German term being Zusammenbildung, show characteristics of composition and derivation. By suffixing the basic syntagma rotes Haar with the suffix ig, we obtain rothaarig, because there is no base haarig, which means related to hair. The word formation patterns mentioned occur in the same or in a similar way in Middle High German, but undergo changes when it comes to the linguistic means applied and their functional weight within the system. We'll first pick out a few cases of verbal and nominal word formation in which Middle High German system is particularly distinctive compared to the Old High German system. We will then briefly leave the systematic perspective and consider the word formation of two Middle High German varieties for illustrative purposes. First, some words on word formation of verbs. Let's start by looking at present-day German again. If one disregards technical language coinages such as Schwingschleifen, which means to use a vibrating sander, compounding is hardly used in New High German verbal word formation. Instead, derivations dominate, in particular formations with inseparable prefixes such as bestehen, in Sie besteht die Prüfung, and those with separable prefixes such as aufstehen, Sie steht vom Tisch auf. In contrast, suffixation is marginal for verbal word formation in contemporary language. Looking back at the history of verbal word formation in German, this was by no means always the case, and Middle High German is essentially responsible for the situation in the modern language. In Old High German, there were still functional methods for deriving verbs using suffixes. Let us briefly recap the inflection of the Old High German weak verbs. There are three classes distinguished with different vocalism in the suffix. The suffixes in the case of the en and on verbs are still present in Old High German throughout, while the Germanic jan suffix occurs only in a modified form or disappears entirely. But another fact is crucial. The suffixes en, on and, with some restrictions, jan, are recognizable as derivational suffixes in Old High German because they can form certain semantic classes. A large number of jan verbs are factitives. They modify the base verb to add the concept to make something done. By adding jan, Old High German trinkern, a strong verb, becomes tränken, to make drink to water. Old High German liedern, to move, another strong verb, becomes leiten, to make, move, to lead. A large number of on verbs, second class, are ornatives. They modify the base noun by adding the concept to provide with. Old High German salber, ointment, becomes salbon, to apply ointment to anoint. Old High German lob, praise, becomes lobon, to provide with praise to praise. And finally, a large number of en verbs are inchoatives. They modify the base adjective by adding the concept to become. Old High German fool, for instance, rotten, becomes foolen, to become rotten, to rot. Heil, sane, becomes heilen, to become healed, to heal. This largely functional system of verb derivation is lost with, you guessed it maybe, the weakening of unstressed syllables in Middle High German. The suffixes no longer differ from other infinitive endings and are therefore no longer recognizable as an expression of semantically differentiated word formation patterns. With the onset of the weakening of unstressed syllables, the way is clear for foregrounding prefixation in German verb derivation. In late Old High German, which, as we have seen, was already subject to the weakening of unstressed syllables to some extent, this restructuring is already noticeable. In addition to the original suffix formations such as the factitive jan verb swenden, to make something disappear, or the inchoative en verb blinden, to go blind, there was a development of prefixed variants such as verswenden or irblinden. The appearance of these suggests that the transparency of the suffixes was no longer given by this point in time. Middle High German then finally eliminates the prefix-less variants and extends the process to cases that neither belong to the Old High German factitives nor to the Old High German inchoatives. The functions of the old suffix system were thus taken over by a new system of verbal prefixation. The system of Middle High German verbal prefixation is fully functional, but as for all innovations, its integrity is potentially at risk, at the beginning at least. The difference between separable and inseparable prefixes is less clear than in New High German. For instance, Middle High German aber, New High German ab, or ihn, New High German ein, which are usually separable, may behave like inseparable prefixes in certain contexts. This is often the case when they occur in end rhyme position, as in the examples you see on the slide. And even with multiple prefixes, separable prefixes usually behave in some cases like they were inseparable. Consider the two examples on the other slide. From a contrastive point of view, the common features between these passages are the formations with an inseparable prefix, where in the present language there should be formations with a separable one. These specific observations are an indication of a general trend. Verbal prefixes are initially prototypically inseparable in Middle High German, a trend that only begins to develop in early New High German, more precisely around 1500, in the direction of the prototypical distribution for verb derivation in the modern language. In today's system, over 70% of verbal prefixes are separable, not inseparable. The Middle High German situation can possibly be explained by two assumptions. First, inseparable prefixes are the more typical affixes because most other affixes are also inseparable. And second assumption, inseparable prefixes are better affixes because they better ensure the integrity of the newly formed words as continuous phonetic strings. The further the word formation pattern is integrated, the less important the criterion is. Overall, however, it can be said that prefix formations have become a trademark of verbal word formation in German since Middle High German. Compared to the new methods of prefixation, verbal suffixation in Middle High German falls ever more to the wayside, but without being as marginal as in the contemporary language. Less than 10% of verb formation in Middle High German takes place with explicit suffixes, the inventory of which also remained relatively restricted. But no rule without exceptions. Of particular interest, however, is the loan suffix ieren, primarily from a static perspective. Formations based on ieren account for at least 20% of the verbal suffix formations in Middle High German. The suffix came into German in two stages, so to speak. The older group of ieren formations contains lexemes that were borrowed from late or church Latin, e.g. disputieren, glorieren, or absolvieren. The younger group includes borrowing from Old French, which came into German as part of the courtly relations we discussed previously. The formations of the second group can be differentiated in accordance with their motivation. Cases like Middle High German schumpfieren, from Old French déconfire, to destroy, put enemies to flight, defeat. It is probably the lexicalized formation that was borrowed. Sorry. I'll just read the passage from the slide with Schumpfieren. Damit der Kühne und der Zagge beide geschumpfiert sind, from Wolframs Willeheim. The next group includes derivations in ieren whose Roman space was also borrowed into Middle High German. The motivation for these formations can often be easily understood from the textual tradition. In Ulrich from Etzenbach, Wilhelm von Wenden, in relation to the description of a courtly tournament, the Iren formation buhurdieren is made transparent in this way. Dohurb sich stolzer buhurt, stolz was ihr hadieren, ritterlich ihr buhurdieren. Finally, it is comparatively rare that the loan suffix iren is combined with a native base. This is the case, for example, with stolzieren, behaving proudly, from Middle High German stolz, proud. Ging stolzieren hin und her, recht als ein Pfauer wär. Let's switch to word formation of nouns and adjectives. In beginning our consideration of the word formation of Middle High German nominals, we should think first about the situation in the modern day language. Two particularly dynamic trends stand out here. In the field of noun formation, determinative compounds show an almost unrivaled productivity in the formation of new lexical material. This is relatively easy to show. From the year 2000 to 2020, the corpus linguist Lothar Lemnitzer regularly published finds of neologisms on his website Wortwarte. The final list from December 10th, 2020 contains 15 entries, 14 of which can be classified as determinative compounds. Only the adjective bollwerkhaft is out of the ordinary. In the field of adjective formation in the contemporary language, the productivity of suffixoids or semisuffixes is striking. Suffixoids are word formation elements that occur simultaneously as lexical morphemes and derivational morphemes. A classic example would be the sequence Werk, which occurs both as a constituent of determinative compounds such as Wasserwerk and as a derivational morpheme in collective formations such as Laubwerk. In the contemporary language, for example, the element technisch is particularly productive, the occurrence of which in forms such as alkoholtechnisch, bikinitechnisch, or haarfarbetechnisch has nothing to do with technology, but should be paraphrased as relating to something. Historically, the lexical use of technisch as related to technology is of course the primary meaning. The increase in formations such as alkoholtechnisch thus reflects a seepage of lexical elements into word formation. As characteristic as the highly productive determinative compounds and the conversion of lexical morphemes into derivational morphemes are for the word formation of contemporary New High German, both tendencies are anything but new. For comparison, let us look at the corresponding word formation processes in the older language periods. The determinative compound is already a productive pattern in Old High German, both for the formation of proper nouns and for the formation of common nouns, as can be shown by examining material from the Hildebrandslied, written around 830, the oldest surviving textual witness of Germanic heroic poetry. If you take a closer look at the compounds of this text, you will see that they all represent a certain type of composition. The first constituent restricts the denotation of the second. There are no other syntactic or semantic relationships between the two constituents. In fact, this is the original type of compound, which is why Jakob Grimm called it a real compound, ein echtes Kompositum. Noun plus noun results in compound. A Königreich, Old, Middle and New High German, is a Reich ruled by a König. In contrast, a second type of determinative compound is not yet documented in the Old High German period. It is based on the reanalysis of syntactic structures, which led Grimm to call it unecht, unechte Komposita. we are dealing with cases such as Gotteshaus, the first constituent of which, Gottes, makes it clear that it was not originally a compound, but a nominal syntagma made up of the genitive attribute Gottes and the nucleus Haus, or Middle High German Hus. This type of composition is attested in Middle High German, but its implementation faced certain obstacles. As long as Middle High German makes extensive use of the prepositive genitive attribute, the so-called Saxon genitive, sequences such as Sines Vater Hus or des Menschen Seele cannot be read as determinative compounds but suggest an interpretation as nominal syntagmata. The reading as a compound finally prevailed only in early New High German. Another hurdle that stands in the way of the widespread diffusion of the systematically well-established determinative compound pattern in Middle High German is the tendency to express certain meanings through syntax rather than word formation, which is particularly dominant in Middle High German literary texts, as illustrated from a passage from Wolfram's Willeheim. I read it first. Diese Echte mochten's Dritte nicht, das ihn gab's drittes Kleid, der mit der Stangen fuhr in Streit. There are two possible readings of this passage. First, syntactical, one translated roughly by, the eight could not fight before he who fought before them with the pole gave them battle ropes. And the other reading rather based on word formation, before the pole man in front of them gave them battle ropes. What are the benefits of these respective constructions or readings? The syntactic expression has the advantage of greater clarity and greater syntactic connectivity, which cannot be shown here. In comparison with the syntactic alternatives, compounds like New High German Stangenkämpfer are more economical in terms of expression but have the disadvantage of ambiguity, i.e. they have several readings that can often but not always be resolved in the actual context where the compounds occur. In the history of German, the tendency to delegate more and more syntax to word formation could obviously claim greater relevance than the criterion of unambiguous expression. This at least explains, in retrospect, the ambiguity of the German noun compounds, which is particularly noticeable from a comparative point of view. The New High German compound Zeitmaschine can easily be paraphrased as machine for the production of time, if you think of Eismaschine, or instead as machine to replace time, if we think of Lungenmaschine, whereas the French compound machine à remonter le temps makes it clear, even without context, that we're dealing with a machine made for time travel, quite usual for language historians. The tendency of German to delegate more and more syntax to word formation can be interpreted as an expression of an overarching trend that is known as univerbation in word formation research. Univerbation is an extremely complex phenomenon, the effects of which extend from graphemics to syntax. Christian Lähnemann defined univerbation as, quote, the syntagmatic condensation of a sequence of words recurrent in discourse into one word. It affects both lexemes and grammatical formatives, unquote. We've already seen from the increase of derivatives with a separate prefix that not all developments in German are in the direction of increasing univerbation. However, the last development that we want to deal with in connection with the history of German word formation again highlights univerbation tendencies. It is about the emergence of suffixoids, i.e. elements that migrate from the lexicon into word formation. The element los is very common in contemporary New High German as a highly productive suffix for adjective derivation. It denotes the absence of what is designated by its substantive base. iPhone los would be the property of someone who does not have an iPhone. The element los is less widespread as a standalone lexeme In this capacity, it only appears in a few expressions such as "Was ist los?" What's the matter? And in archaisms like "ein loses Mundwerk haben" to have a quick tongue. Nonetheless, these isolated usages suggest that los can look back on the past as a full-fledged lexeme. How then do we trace its descent into this state? In Old High German, the lexeme los occurs at least in 6 different usages. I'll click through rapidly. Nevertheless, the interpretation of the only contextual evidence, Arbeolauser from the Hildebrandslied, shows that, theoretically, 2 readings are possible, one as a suffixoid, New High German erbelos, deprived of s, one as a lexeme, New High German des Erbes beraubt, deprived of inheritance. The context and the spelling with spaces strongly suggest the latter reading, of course. Los still occurs as a lexeme in Middle High German, but its range of usages is clearly reduced from 6 in Old High German to 3. This is just one of 2 tendencies that makes the development of the lexeme los into the suffix los plausible. The second is the increase of derivatives in los. While the number of these in Old High German is less than 40, Middle High German already has 156 formations, of which more than 80% are attested in sources before 1300. A second example of the conversion of a lexical morpheme into a word formation morpheme is the development of the noun suffix heit, which is used to derive abstract adjectives such as Middle High German Schönheit, Klugheit, etc., and is still productive in contemporary language. In Gothic, haedus, way or manner, only appears as a substantive. In Old High German, alongside a freely occurring substantive heit, meaning person, personality, shape, there is already a whole series of compounds in which heit functions as a base word, such as Zaggerheit, which means timidity. The noun heit occurs only occasionally in Middle High German. Furthermore, in addition to heit as a second constituent, the variants ikheit or kite emerge, which have never stood as free morphemes. Therefore, Middle High German Bitterkeit, with the suffix kite, can only be interpreted as a derivative. In addition, the noun as a free lexeme disappears from everyday use. The freely occurring lexeme thus became a bound derivation and morpheme that is both series-forming and highly productive. After the systematic approach, some words on special types of word formation. There is no doubt that a systematic approach must be taken in describing the word formation of an individual language or a historical language stage, and the first part of today's lecture was designed accordingly. Using the example of verbal compounding in present-day German, we've already seen that certain systematic possibilities are exploited under the influence of factors that cannot be properly or systematically described in linguistics. From this point of view, those formations may appear marginal. However, if we adopt a pragmatic approach and turn to the study of word formation in some technical jargons, we may realize that verbal compounding is virtually their trademark. Examples of such compounds are New High German Brennhärten, Presspolieren, Spülbohren, etc. But these processes often remain confined to their original variety. But theoretically, it's possible for them to spread beyond. And to some extent, the latter development occurred in the emergence of a group of abstract nouns in Middle High German, while the lexemes we shall consider in conclusion have left no trace whatsoever in contemporary German word formation. Word formation of scholasticism and mysticism. When the German Franciscan David von Augsburg, who died in 1272, complains in his writing of the revelation and redemption of the human race that he and his followers lack words when we want to speak of divine nature. This primarily addresses the dilemma that is typical of mysticism in the late Middle Ages, to put into words the unio mystica of soul and deity, which evades both observation and description. Swie wir dis heißen einer Hande Gewürke, das ist doch unrechte gesprochen. Wann Gott ist die ewige Ruhe in ihm selber und die unwandelte Stätigkeit je und jemmer. Uns gebristet Worte, zwar wir von göttlicher Natur reden sollen. In addition, the statement also resonates with a sociolinguistic nuance. As we saw in the lecture on late Middle High German, in the sphere of religious and theological writing, German finds it particularly difficult to assert itself in the context of Latin dominance. At the same time, especially in the course of the religious lay movements, which were gaining ground from the beginning of the 13th century, there was an increased need not only for vernacular writing, but also for vernacular methods of expression in general to reproduce the content that had previously been conveyed exclusively in Latin. Vernacular translations of Latin scholastic texts play a key role in this linguistic acquisition process. And an essential part of linguistic acquisition concerns an empty part of the vocabulary that will be filled for the first time by using word formation. What part of the vocabulary are we talking about here? Let's have a look at a passage of the Middle High German translation of Bonnet Wansche. Wann aber nit Wesen ein Beraubung oder Ausschluss ist der Wesenheit, so fallt es nit in die Verständnis, denn durch das Wesen. Aber das Wesen entfallt nit durch ein anders, denn alles, das da verstanden wird, das wird ein Wedders verstanden als das Nit-Wesen oder als das Wesen in künftiger Muckligkeit oder als das Wesen in Gegenwärtigkeit. Due to its word formation system, German would have been able to form nominal derivatives such as Beraubung, Ausschluss, Wesenheit, Verständnis, Muggligkeit or Gegenwärtigkeit from the very beginning. This systematic possibility was only realized in late Middle High German, primarily because knowledge domains that required extensive use of abstract nouns were previously covered by the overarching writing culture of Latin. Against this backdrop, it is no wonder that the abstract nouns of German scholasticism are closely based on the Latin model. Beraubung or Ausschluss translates Privatio, Wesenheit translates Essendi, Verständnis translates Intellektum, Muggligkeit translates Potentia, and Gegenwärtigkeit translates Actu. The fact that the German Bonaventure passage, despite its closeness to the Latin original, refers exclusively to indigenous language material is also noteworthy, even it is not really astonishing given the well-known sociolinguistic background. In order to be able to grasp this aspect more precisely, one should first briefly recall Werner Beeth's typology of foreign word material adapted and modified by David Duckworth. Let's have a look. In the area of loans, Betz and Duckworth fundamentally differentiate between importation of elements that remain identifiable as foreign words such as cool, partial substitutions such as Coolheit, or borrowings such as New High German Keks, which has been entirely integrated into the target language, and substitution that operates with native language material but organizes it according to foreign language models. The foreign language model can belong to the signified, as in the case of a loan meaning, Lehnbedeutung, or to the signifier. In the latter area, two types of loan formation appear particularly relevant for the word formation of German scholasticism. According to Beetz, a loan translation or Lehnübersetzung is a one-to-one reproduction of word formation from the source language into the target language, while a loan rendering or Lehnübertragung means a free adaptation of a source language formation. As already indicated, the translation literature hardly copies any word material from the Latin source. The few documented cases such as conscientiae, definieren, definierunge, etc. really belong to the core vocabulary of scholastic jargon. As you can see, some lexemes have made their way into the vocabulary of Standard German. Even within this limited inventory, however, the language of German scholasticism exhibits rivalries that, as in the case of Trinität versus Dreifaltigkeit, continue into the contemporary language. Looking at the cases of loan formation, there is a slight dominance of loan translations close to the source language, such as Großmütigkeit to Latin magnanimitas, even in cases where the vernacular lexicon would have had alternatives. For Latin generatio, instead of the loan translation Gebärung, an alternative would have been Geburt, which was already attested in Old High German. Loan renditions such as überselig for Latin superbonus are on the whole less frequent. In the often elusive area of loan meanings, i.e. the orientation of the content to the source language, we will restrict ourselves to the case of Middle High German Milte. The term comes from the domain of Germanic vassalage, and in this context describes the duty of a lord to give his subordinate what is part of their false sustenance, in a completely neutral way. In courtly culture and the associated literary texts, under the influence of Christian ideals, the concept was reinterpreted as the ruler's virtue and meant generosity. The expansion of meaning continues in late Middle High German, where Milte now means mercy, goodness, friendship in general. The decisive impetus for the late Middle High German development was the competition that had arisen from Milte from the loan translation Miltigkeit, which came from the scholastic translation literature and was modeled on the Latin clementia bonitas, but above all pietas. Instead of displacing the old key concept of feudalism, however, the formation Miltigkeit, so to speak, infects it with the corresponding semantic nuance of Latin pietas, the meaning of late Middle High German Milte, mercy, kindness, friendship, is to be interpreted as the result of a borrowed meaning. And a final chapter for today, dialectical word formation, the case of Wolfram von Eschenbach. As much as Gottfried von Straßburg praises Hartmann's crystal clear words in the literary excursus of Tristan, as you may remember, he does not think much of the language of Wolfram von Eschenbach, whom he reproaches for jumping around mit Bickelworten, words thrown around like dices, auf der Wortheide. To be fair, however, it must be added that Wolfram himself seems to have been aware of the eccentricity of his use of language, as he conceded in the context of a narrator's comment in Wilhelm, that his German was so krump, weird, that there was a need for explanation. There is no need for explanation at this point, but there are numerous cases with regard to Wolfram's word formation. Since there is no overall presentation, despite numerous references in the secondary literature, I will limit myself here to a brief overview sorted by word formation type and word class. In the field of compounding, Wolfram exploits the previously explained tolerance of German for ambiguous formations to the limit of what is understandable. What is meant by an Aderstoß? First example on the slide. Viewed in isolation, the constituents do not show anything that requires explanation. Ader means vein, Stoß means hit. The context then reveals that the reasoning behind the compound is to characterize Lohengrin, participle son, as a true paragon of courtly virtue, i.e. as trüve, reliable, milde, bountiful, and usually stäte. However, Wolfram is not satisfied with such conventional catalogues of virtues and is therefore looking for a synonym for the state of constancy that can be formulated as strikingly as possible. Someone who remains generous even when the blood boils in his veins is a model, must be a model of constancy. Another of Wolfram's compounds, the second example on the slide, Falschheitswand, represents a successful compromise between the traditional tendency of Middle High German towards syntax and its modern replacement by word formation. The root swand means destruction, originally clearing of the forest, and is an implicit derivation of the Greek verb swenden, to destroy, whose valency is nevertheless preserves. Participle is the personification of the destruction of disloyalty. The economy of the compositional process can be shown in the analysis of Wolfram's adjective formation Strahlsnittig. Third example from the titular fragment. Formally, it is a combination of the substantive strahl, arrow, and the adjective snittig, cut, past participle or wounded, which could be paraphrased by saying wounded by an arrow. But what is a mal, a track that has been wounded by an arrow? The flexibility of Wolfram's neologism only becomes apparent in context. After all, he shaped it in order to refer pars pro toto to the mal, the track of a deer wounded by an arrow. At times, Wolfram's formations approach the limit of what is systematically permissible. The compound, number 4 on the slide, Sonneblicker, can be segmented into the usual Middle High German nominal compound Sonneblick, sunbeam, and the inflectional ending er. Middle High German does not have such a word formation pattern. The apparent compound turns out to be a pseudo-derivative of Sonneblick and its final sounds ik, which is reinterpreted as an adjective forming suffix based on the model of Kraft, ik, from Kraft. Translated as closely as possible into New High German, a Sonneblicker Schur would be some kind of Sonnenscheiner shower, in other words, a rain shower when the sun is shining. In the area of verbal compounding, the system constraints of Middle High German mean that Wolfram has relatively little freedom for spectacular word formations. The few exceptions are compounds with implicit derivations as second constituents, such as hochwartswinden, disappearance of arrogance, or Sattelruhmen, leaving the saddle. Finally, a few comments on Wolfram's derivation. It is striking how often he refers to the pattern of ge prefixation to form collective nouns such as Geschelle, a totality of bells. Some notable neologisms obtained by suffixation include knappelig, in a varlet's manner, or Tafelrunde Rede, Knight of the Round Table, the latter formed on the basis of synonymous Tafelrunde instead of Tafelrunde, round table, like the more common Middle High German Tafelrundere, with one syllable less. In the area of Wolfram's verbal derivatives, there are few spectacular cases, such as the nominal Galunen. There it is. Galunen, which means to beat it through as if you were tanning it with alum, or the prefixation überschlafen, to sleep all day, which probably has to do with the fact that the system itself is quite creative here, which leaves little room for idealectal innovation. Wolfram's neologisms in the field of adjective derivation make particular use of the suffixes lich and bere and the negative prefix un. You see some examples: ungastlich, unlos. That's nothing very spectacular. But finally, an interesting, if rather anecdotal case, where Wolfram fills the German determinative compounding pattern with French word material. Instead of the correct Old French Comte de Chastel or Châtel, he uses the pattern of Middle High German Burggrabe to produce pseudo Old French Charte de la Comte, transferred to modern French Château de Comte instead of the regular Comte de Château. Scholars are still arguing about whether Wolfram was really so bad at French that he didn't know that the base constituent comes first in French compounds, followed by the determiner, or whether he was making fun of the fashion to use French lexemes in German courtly literature, as discussed earlier. Remember probably the example of Tannhäuser. Finally, a methodological question. How do we even know that such and other formations attributed to Wolfram really represent his literary idiolect? Well, in spectacular cases such as Charte de la Comte, the verdict may still be intuitively clear, but the only reliable method that can be used in a corpus language is the painstaking proof that this or that formation is only found in Wolfram, or at least first in Wolfram. In such context, the large Middle High German Belegwörterbücher, dictionaries based on source quotations, which can be conveniently accessed via the Wörterbuchnetz.de portal, are a useful tool, even if they are not the final corpus linguistic conclusion. If we check any new formation attributed to Wolfram or suspected to have belonged to his idiolect, such as the already mentioned Tafelrunde Rähre, in one of these dictionaries available online, such as Lexis Handwörterbuch, as you can see here, we find that this formation, at least according to the quotations listed, actually happens to occur for the first and only time in Wolfram's Parzival. Until a further, earlier occurrence is proven, we can therefore regard it as part of Wolfram's idiolectal word formation. That's all for today. In the next and final lecture, we'll deal with Middle High German syntax. Thank you very much.